Hello everyone, in this video we are going to talk about Docker Compose. So what is Docker Compose? Docker Compose is a tool that you can use to define and share multi-container application. Docker Compose simplifies the process of managing complex applications that require multiple containers, enabling you to define and control your application's entire environment using a single configuration file. So, for example, let's assume you are building a project using Node.js as the backend and MongoDB as database and React as a frontend. For this, you may have to manage different files for frontend, backend, and other containerized blob, which can be difficult to manage, and that is when Docker Compose tool comes to the rescue. With Docker Compose, you can create a single image that starts all of these containers in just a single command. You don't need to start each separately. With Docker Compose, you can even define multiple objects like services, networks, and volumes required for your application. This is all mentioned in a YAML file called docker-compose.yaml. It uses the extension .yml. Okay. This file describes the containers like our frontend or backend that makes up our application and their dependencies and configurations and other settings. So, before diving further with understanding the YAML file structure, let's see the Docker Compose installation process. The one way and the easiest way to get Docker Compose is to install Docker Desktop. If you have Docker Desktop installed, Docker Compose should already be available. So open the terminal or command prompt and type the command docker-compose version and click enter. If you have Docker Compose installed, you should see the version here. Or if you don't have a Docker desktop and just want to install Docker Compose as a standalone, I will encourage you to visit the Docker website, that is docs.docker.com/compose/install. And here you will see the installation processes for Docker Compose: install Compose plugin or install Compose standalone. So just follow the process. So now let's understand what is YAML. YAML stands for YAML Ain't Markup Language. YAML uses indentation and simple syntax, relying on spaces and new lines, making it easy to read and write. YAML supports various data types, including scalars such as string, numbers, and booleans, or sequences such as array or list, and mappings like key value pairs. It also supports more complex structures. Okay, now let's start understanding the Docker Compose YAML file structure one by one. You have to make the file that is called docker-compose.yaml. You should use YAML extension. It's really very important. Okay, in a Docker Compose file, the version field at the top specifies the version of the Docker Compose file format that is being used. It defines the syntax and features available in the file. And now next we have services. In this example, we are defining three services, that is frontend, backend, and database. We will go through all of this one by one, so don't worry. The frontend service is built using the Docker file in the frontend directory. It maps port 3000 on the host to the port 3000 in the container, allowing us to access to the React frontend application on port 3000. The network section here defines a network named myapp_network. This allows container to communicate with each other on same network. The backend service is built using the Docker file in the backend directory. It maps port 8080 on the host to the port 8080 in the container, enabling API requests to reach the Node.js backend. The depends on database indicates that the backend service depends on database service. This means that the database service will be started before the backend service. The network section here similarly means that we have a network defined myapp_network, which is used by frontend and also by backend. This allows container to communicate with one another. The database service uses the latest MongoDB image from Docker Hub. It maps port 27017 on the host to the port 27017 in the container, allowing the backend to connect to the MongoDB instance. A volume in a Docker is a way to persist and share data between containers or between containers and the host machine. It provides the way for storing and retrieving data that need to be preserved even when the containers are stopped or restarted. In this case, MongoDB underscore data is the name given to the volume, and /data /db is the path within the MongoDB container where the data will be stored. The network section here defines a network named myapp_network, which is used by all the services as we have seen, by frontend, by backend, and even database. Okay, it allows these containers to communicate with one another. The volume section defines a named volume called MongoDB_data, which is used by the database service, right? This volume is used to process the MongoDB data, ensuring that data is retained even if the container is recreated. So now, as you have the basic understanding of the structure of Docker Compose YAML file, let's move further with our real-world application. So now let's start working with real world application. As you will see here that I have a Docker Compose folder in which I have backend folder and a frontend folder. This is a to-do list application that uses Node.js as backend, MongoDB as database, and React as frontend. For both the folder for backend and frontend, we will create a Docker file. Okay, so let's start with creating a Docker file for backend. And as you will all know that to create a Docker file, we don't have to use any extension, but the D should be capitalized and other words in lower cases. And now let's start adding instruction in our Docker file. So now our first instruction is from node 10 alpine. This sets the base image for Docker image. In this case, it means that the image will use Node.js version 10 and is based on lightweight alpine. Then we have our second command, that is workdir /user source and application. This sets the working directory inside the container to user, source, and then app. Okay. Our third instruction copies the package.json and package-log.json files to the host machine to the current working directory, okay, inside the container. So our next step is to run npm install. This is our next instruction, which runs npm install command inside the container. It installs the dependencies that are specified in the package.json file. This ensures that the required dependencies are correctly installed in the container. Our next instruction is copy and to periods. This copies the entire content of the current directory to the current working directory inside the container. The expose 3001 instruction specifies that the container will listen on the port 3001. Our next and last instruction defines the command that will be executed when the container starts. In this case, it specifies running the node command with server.js as the argument. Here we have the server.js file. This will start the Node.js application. Okay, so now as we have built the Docker file for our backend, let's save this file and let's now create the Docker file for our frontend. And in the front end, we will create a Docker file with capital D and remaining words lowercase. Okay, most of the instruction in this file will be same as our backend Docker file. The first instruction is to create the base image. In this, it's using Node.js of version 14. Okay. Then our next instruction is to set the working directory. This sets the working directory inside the container to app. And then we have the next instruction, that is to copy package.json and package-log.json files. And our next instruction is to run npm install inside the container so that it install all the dependencies present in the package.json file. And this expose 3000 means that the container will listen on the port 3000. So now our final and last instruction is to run npm start command to start the application. And now let's save this file. And now as we have created Docker file for the front end and Docker file for the backend, let's now create the Docker Compose file. Finally, our next step is to create a Docker Compose file. Let me just close this, and now as you will see here that I already have Docker Compose file which uses the YAML extension, and open our Docker Compose YAML file. We are going to go through all of this one by one, so you don't need to worry, okay? So now as you will see in this Docker Compose YAML file, here we have the version for the Compose file which is 3.8. Now the next we have services. This Docker Compose file defines 3 services: web, API, and Mongo. Let's break down each services and let's try to understand them. In web, this build frontend specifies that the Docker image for the web service should be built from the frontend directory that contains a Docker file. We just created it right now. The depends on indicates that the web service depends on API service. That means the API service will be started before the web service. The port 3000, this maps the port 3000 of the container to the port 3000 of the host machine. It allows us to access our front-end application on the localhost 3000. This network-backend connects the web service to the network backend, okay? This allows communication between service within the same network. In API service, we have the build backend, which specifies that the Docker image for the API service should be built from the backend directory. This backend folder contains a Docker file which we created, okay? Depends on Mongo indicates that this API service depends on Mongo service. This means that the Mongo service will be started before the API service. This port 3001 of the container to the port 3001 of the host machine. It allows us to access the backend on the localhost 3001. This network just basically means it connects to the network backend, allowing us to communicate with the services. Mongo image Mongo specifies that the Mongo service will use the official Mongo Docker image from the Docker Hub registry. Restart always configures the Mongo container to always restart if it stops for any reason. A volume in a Docker is a way to persist and share data between containers, right? As we have discussed this earlier. It provides the way for storing data and retrieving them, okay? In this case, we have MongoDB underscore data, that is the name for the volume, and it is storing data in /data/db. Okay, this is where our data will be stored. Now these are the environment variables. This sets the environment variable for MongoDB service. Okay. These variables can be accessed within the MongoDB container to set up the initial database and user credential. It exposes the MongoDB container port 27017 on the host machine as well. This allows us to access the MongoDB instance on the port 27017. This network section defines a network called network-backend. It is used to connect the service with the Docker Compose file. This basically allows services to communicate with each other, and as you will see that we have used network with all of our services, with Mongo, with API, and even with web. Okay, the volume section here defines that we have a volume called MongoDB underscore data. By defining a named volume, the data will persist even if the container is stopped or removed. Now, As we have our Docker Compose file ready, now we can start this up. So let's open the terminal. You can use the terminal which is inbuilt in VS Code or the terminal in Windows or command prompt. Now let's run the command docker images ls. And now as you will see here that I do not have any image running on my computer. I don't have any repository. Okay, so we have to build this image. So now to run this application, we have the command docker compose up. We can also use -deflag. This is optional because if you want to run everything in the background, you can use -deflag. Okay, or just simply use docker compose up command, and let's click enter. And now as you will see here that it has started running and pulling Mongo and other services as well. This might take few moments, so I'll be right back. And now as you will see here that it has finished building, and when you scroll you will see the message that says that server is listening on the port 3001. You can even access this, okay? And when you even scroll down more, you will see that it has compiled successfully. So when you click on control plus click, and it will take you to the local host 3000, and you will see our to-do list simple application. So we have successfully created our application using the compose file and docker file for each of the folders like frontend and backend. And now if you want to stop this container from running, you can just type Control C, and now you will see here that it is stopping all the containers. Or you can even use the command docker compose down, and it will stop all these containers. And now when you run the command docker images, you will see that here we have 3 docker images, one for frontend, one for backend, and one for our database. And now one thing here I want to share it with you is that you can even use Docker Compose file even if you only have a front-end application or a back-end application. While Docker Compose is commonly used to define and manage multiple service containers, but Docker Compose file can still be useful for running single service application such as front-end or back-end. Okay, so this is all for this video, and I hope you understood what is Docker Compose and how can we create Docker Compose file. So I'll see you in the next video. Till then, bye bye and happy coding.